next interview is with Tom Lawlor, Jiu-Jitsu black belt, retired MMA fighter, and now pro wrestler. When I first started putting the concept of this channel together, he was one of the people that came to mind that I wanted to interview. So I was really excited to sit down with him, and it turned out really well. I also want to say thanks for all the views, likes, and support. If you want to help out the channel, leave a comment and a like. Thanks for watching.
Tom, thanks a lot for doing this. First question, what got you into martial arts?
I don't consider myself to be a martial artist. I do martial arts, but I consider myself more of a fighter, more of a competitor, a sportsman. If I wasn't doing, a competition where I'm fighting against somebody, I'm sure I'd be involved in, something else like strongman. Maybe I would have kept playing football. A lot of guys get into martial arts and perform martial arts because they have this desire to live out like a life that you can only live in the past, where you live by a warrior's code. Me, I'm interested in winning, and that's what interests me. And that's how I got into martial arts. I saw people fighting, and I saw what was effective and what wasn't. And I said, hey, I'm going to get involved in this. I'm going to do the martial arts that win fights. And that's how my journey began, I guess.
What do you consider the martial arts that are the most effective?
If you look at the root term martial arts, it's based on man-to-man battle. So many people think of martial arts from a viewpoint of like there's magic and trickery behind the techniques, but look at what's lasted throughout the years. Boxing, wrestling, and people don't usually consider those to be martial arts, but they're Western martial arts. Judo is one of the most widely practiced martial arts in the world, and that is the root of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which also is one of the major martial arts that helps people win fights. So it's the major things that you see in the UFC today. Those are the things that have lasted the test of time.
When you started to now, what's the difference in the gyms? Were they as polished as they are now, or were they really down and dirty, gritty?
Back in the day, my first MMA class or jiu-jitsu class or, fighting class, whatever you want to call it, was I could count amateur wrestling. So I began amateur wrestling in 1997. But that's kind of like a more sterile environment. It's more controlled. There's coaches there. There's, people your similar age that you can compete with. When I first went to any sort of jiu-jitsu or MMA gym, it was a place called JBA in Fall River, Massachusetts, run by a guy who's no longer with us, Don Banville. And it was like, I was a 17-year-old kid at the time, and I was in there matched up with 6 shirtless 40-year-old dudes who are, pouring sweat. They're on top of me. I'm getting chest hairs in my mouth. There's rats running around in the back. There's rust everywhere. It was in an old mill building in a rundown town. And that was kind of par for the course. MMA wasn't on anyone's radar in the 90s and 2000s as something that was like a viable career. Nobody was running an MMA gym in order to make money. So the facilities were terrible. But there was a certain charm to him. And as time went by, obviously things have improved. There's more money in the sport. The UFC is known worldwide, and people have been able to, harvest some of the top fighters in the world out of, world-class facilities. But that was not the case back in the day. And there was actually a point where if you went to a gym and it looked nice, it was probably too nice to be an effective place to learn how to fight. So I have a huge place in my heart for grimy dungeon gyms where it looks like you're probably going to get assaulted if you're there for more than 30 minutes, but those are the best places to learn.
Do you remember your first fight and how that went?
I remember about my first fight. It's tough to remember like the actual feelings that you have at that time. My first fight was in 2003. So we're talking 21 years ago. Like a complete adult life has gone on, and they can drink alcohol too. So possibly wild adult life has gone on since that fight took place. But I was on a show. It was called, I believe, Extreme Fighting 5, which was put on by my trainer at the time, Don Banville, who I mentioned earlier. And it's odd because if you look at this show, if you look at the card from the show now, there were like 3 or 4 guys who ended up being in the UFC. Myself, Marcus Davis was on that show, Dante Rivera, and I'm probably leaving out some names. So this is a small show in 2003 that ended up having, maybe 5 fights on it, but multiple high-level guys on that show. And whatever the case was, I remember I was in the back warming up, and my trainer comes in. He says, "Hey, the fight before you fell out, you got to go right now." And I was scheduled to be, towards the end. Maybe if there was 6 fights, I was like 5th. Like I don't want to call myself the co-main event because I was nobody. I may have just been at the end of the show. But he comes in and he says, "Hey, like nobody else is ready. You got to go right now." So I had no time to warm up, but also I had no time to get nervous, which was great. So I just went out there and I knew how to wrestle. I knew how to be aggressive. I was like 20 years old at the time. They're pretty pissed off, I think, at the time. So, it was relatively easy. The fight lasted 50 seconds. I shot a takedown right off the bat and just kind of pounded the guy's face in until I won.
Right on. So when you step into the octagon, you do the walk out, you step in the octagon, they lock the cage, you look across, you see the guy that's been training for weeks, months to capitalize on your weaknesses. What's that like to see that person? What's the emotions that go through your mind while you're staring back at someone that has been training to possibly try and kill you?
I think this is where one of the instances in which me, having played sports, having been involved in sports, and looking at MMA as kind of a sport, helps, because mentally I'm not thinking about the other guy trying to kill me. I never once, I personally, maybe everybody else out there is on another level. Maybe I should talk to John Jones about this because he's the best fighter in the world, and maybe I was looking at it wrong. But I never once went into a training session thinking about what I was going to do to work on to kill somebody in a fight. The way I looked at it, and I kind of, maybe it was because I watched the early UFCs, but the goal of the early UFCs and the fighters in the early UFCs was to get in there and get out and win, taking as little damage as possible. And that's kind of how I looked at it. I looked at it from like a sporting aspect of how am I going to defeat this guy without letting him impose his will? If that guy, I'm sure I had opponents who looked at me and thought, I want to kill this guy. But realistically, fighting is like, especially in a professional setting, a high-level professional setting, is one of the most controlled environments you could be in. So no, I never had the thought about, really being injured or having a guy kill me. I wanted to win so I could have more money and then go party afterwards.
Right on.
Bad outlook in retrospect, but
that's very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering that. That's something that, people, watch it on TV and they think that you guys are just wanting to kill each other. They don't realize that there's a whole, almost like respect for one another too.
yeah, I'd say more often than not, with the guys that I've fought, I've been friendly with them afterwards on one level or another. Either you run into them that night and you sit down and you actually talk about the fight and, hey, this is what it was like out there. Oh, I thought I was going to be able to do this. I thought I was going to be able to do that. You did this, you did that. I've, developed really good relationships with guys that I fought where, I would call them friends. So like I said, maybe everybody else out there has a different outlook on it, but, sure, it's a fight, but it's also, obviously it's a sport.
So you got suspended from the UFC for allegedly taking steroids.
That's not true. Well, what it would be is a selective androgen receptor module, which wouldn't be a steroid.
And you did not take that.
No. Oh,
not intentionally.
Go ahead. You can ask the question because there's now I could talk even more.
Go ahead.
Well, what's the question?
Were there fighters that you were in the ring with or the octagon with that you had a strong suspicion like this dude's definitely on something because they got more stamina, they're hitting harder, they're recovering quicker between rounds? Did you ever have that suspicion?
I'll answer that first and then backtrack. There was a point in the UFC where the UFC would allow fighters, and this is no longer the case, but they would allow fighters to boost their testosterone to a higher limit to, I guess, make up for your natural loss of testosterone as you age. So there was because I trained with fighters who openly talked about it to me. They said, "Oh yeah, I'm going." These are older fighters. "Oh yeah, I'm going and getting my shot. The doctor gives it to me. The UFC knows." The UFC was open about it, but it was a case in which there was a time where you'd have, maybe say you have a 40-year-old fighter who has 50 fights under his belt, and he's able to take testosterone to raise his levels up to the same level as a 25-year-old fighter who's got 5 fights under his belt. So there was the UFC was like allowing this to happen, and in my mind, that was creating an unfair advantage for the people, actually some of the older fighters, who had this experience advantage. That's something you can't make up, with testosterone or not. And there was also a time where it was, there was not year-round drug testing. So I just assumed everybody was on something in the UFC. If you were fighting somebody, you just had to assume that they were coming in enhanced one way or another, and that they were beating the test because it was an IQ test at that point. It wasn't like USADA would show up at your door and test you at any point. You know what I mean? It would be the night of the fight. So, I mean, go back and look at some of the physiques of some of these guys. It was insane. There's guys who fell off, considerably once there was year-round drug testing implemented. So the usage, I'd say, was definitely very high at one point in the UFC. Now I'm kind of out of the game, so I can't really speak to it. Obviously, having year-round drug testing curbs some of that. Now, as far as my own situation, I was given a 2-year suspension by USADA for Octagon, which is a SARM, a selective androgen receptor module, which is like a longer, it would have the same effects as a steroid, but it's, not chemically the same, the effects aren't as extreme. And now there's been, I couldn't even, name the number of guys, but there's been a number of big name fighters that have tested positive for this, and it's kind of just brushed under the rug. Nate Diaz, Sean O'Malley, Khalil Roundtree is actually going through this right now. And what happens now is if you test positive for ostarine, you're given a 6-month suspension, because in the time period since it happened to me, which is 2016, they've changed the rules because they found that ostarine was, being put into substances. It was like the most readily used contaminant for supplements. So they've reduced the suspension time from 2 years, which I was given, to, I believe, 6 months. Well, now there is evidence, there's papers, there's studies, there's research that's come out that said you can have ostarine transmitted through sweat. Well, so I believe was Sean O'Malley was one of the, this is where I saw this. He was talking about it. He had the study, and I believe he actually may have tested positive through using someone's knee pad, is what they determined. So there's, years later, I spent years of my life having to defend myself to, my own friends of 20 plus years are looking me in the eyes and asking me, did I cheat? No, the answer was no, 100%. And it took away my career. I was suspended for 2 years. The UFC cut me as I was months away from ending that suspension and coming back. I was asking them to have a fight scheduled, asking them if I could go back to work, and they cut me. So, yeah, I'm pretty bitter about the way the whole thing ended, especially with what we've learned in the time period since then. There's nothing that can happen to go back and give me those years back in my career. That was my physical prime, my prime in fighting. I was probably at not my physical peak or my mental peak, but where they kind of coexist at their highest points, and that was taken from me.
Yeah, the new findings doesn't validate the pain you went through and the suffering. But
there's nothing. I mean,
we can't reverse time. So you have probably the most spectacular weigh-ins, dressing up as characters. Does that come from your fascination with pro wrestling? And did that kind of pave the way for you to become a pro wrestler?
I've always loved pro wrestling. I remember when I would come home from elementary school, my grandfather would have on ESPN, and at the time, pro wrestling was on ESPN every day at 4 p.m. So I would watch pro wrestling. It's odd because I don't know if pro wrestling is the reason I did entrances, because what I was doing was like basically directly, not only was I dressing up as other people, but I was stealing what other fighters were doing in Japan, and somewhat in the USA. Some of my favorite fighters of all time, your Kazushi Sakuraba and Genki Sudo, who were both known as showmen, great fighters, some of the most highly skilled guys that have ever come out of Japan. But first and foremost, they were showmen. And Sakuraba was a pro wrestler, but pro wrestling kind of has a different, it's viewed a little bit differently, I guess I would say, by the public in Japan than it is here. So when I say pro wrestler, I mean, he was doing worked fights, but they were done with legitimate techniques, right? But what he did was bring, and it's when he was a pro wrestler, he didn't do this at all. He was just, cut and dried, walk out with his tights, no personality. But when he fought in Pride, Sakuraba would come out dressed up like, a number of different characters. He would have masks on, sometimes suits. Genki Sudo would take it to a whole nother level and do choreographed dance routines while he was dressed in different costumes, sometimes as, baseball players, and he's got, people in uniform, he's throwing balls out at the crowd. I actually he dressed up like Buckethead, the musician, and I enjoyed it so much that I just copied him. So there was one time where I dressed up at a weigh-in as Buckethead, but it was really Genki Sudo as Buckethead. So it was like an Inception. So yeah, basically I was just stealing from guys that I thought were cool.
Yeah, you're gonna go down in the history as like the most memorable for that, I think, in the UFC.
One thing that helps me, I guess, now is that they've really, like, the UFC has homogenized things to a certain point where it's more about the UFC and it's more about being at the show and the brand of what they have than the individuals, right? You're always going to have some larger than life character like a Conor McGregor whose entrance is just, he's got an aura behind him, or, Alex Pereira, Poatan, he'll come out with the mask on. So you're always going to have some stuff like that. But, for the most part, guys are all the same across the board. And some of it is that they're not given the ability to express themselves. There's, you got to wear the Reebok uniform. When I was first in the UFC, I just wear whatever I wanted. So I could, get as many sponsors as I wanted. They didn't care how I was dressed. It was better for them if I was dressed up like some moron, because more people are going to see it. So, I guess thanks UFC for taking away the fun from everybody. So now that I can have a place in history still.
Obviously you do a lot of training. Anybody that looks at your Instagram, you're constantly posting videos of you, doing kettlebells and clubs, still mace. How's the training differ from being an MMA fighter to a pro wrestler? Is it the same? Is the mindset different? Can you explain that?
How do I answer this? Like, how do I explain this? Pro wrestling is kind of like, I guess you could say it's kind of like stunt school or something like that, where you learn what to do, but you can't do it on a regular basis. You cannot go in the ring and get thrown over and over daily and get dumped on your head. A couple times a week, taking a few falls a week is okay, but you cannot actually train professional wrestling for any sustained amount of time. Even doing it a few times a week is too rough on the body. Like, it's a constant car crash over and over and over and over again. And it is done over the past, 6-7 years, like what I would assume is irreparable damage to my joints, and just my overall physical health. But I also love it. So, that's one of the catch-22s of life, is that usually the things that you love the most end up, being detrimental at some point. And pro wrestling's kind of one of those things. With MMA, and especially when I was younger, obviously as you get older, it's tougher. But with MMA and Jiu-Jitsu and kickboxing, I tried to train as much as I could. I probably should have taken more time off. I probably should have recovered better, because I would have been able to put more into some of the training sessions. But I always looked at it from the standpoint of, there's so much to learn if you're going to be in a fight. There's so many aspects that go on. You have to know how to stand up and strike with somebody. You have to know how to defend a takedown. out in the open against the cage. You have to be able to get up off the floor if somebody's on top of you, if somebody's not on top of you. There's just so many aspects that I spent years and years in the gym, and it was like I could never, ever get enough. With pro wrestling, you get enough very, very quickly when you get thrown off the top rope a few times. So MMA training is, I guess, infinitely more enjoyable because you can do it more. Now that I, strictly make money through pro wrestling, I have to be more careful about what I do. So it sounds ridiculous, right? But I get hit more now, unprotected, than I do when I was fighting, right? So I'm actually putting myself in danger more because I have to give myself up to the person in a match. I have to let them hit me. Whereas before, the whole goal of being in a fight is not to let the person do anything to you. So like, there's no comparison. Training for fighting is so much more fun than training for pro wrestling.
So you got to have a lot of trust in pro wrestling. You guys get together and like work things out, or is it just like, okay, I'm going to do this, and a few minutes in, I'm going to do that? Is it? Well, I guess what I'm asking, do you guys like a week ahead do like a roadmap of where it's going to go, or is it just like, we're going to do this and let's see how it goes?
I think people would be really surprised by how matches are planned out. So my wife comes from like a performing background. So she was in one of the Vegas shows here. So she has tons of friends that have been, in shows. And these shows are, you go watch like an acrobatic show, they are so rehearsed. They have everything down pat because they've done it over and over. They do the same thing, virtually the same thing every single night, over and over for sometimes years on end. Professional wrestling is wild. My wife went and trained, and she could not believe the way that it goes down, right? Sometimes you show up at an event and you're wrestling somebody and they want to go in the ring and talk to you for 3 hours about what you're going to do, and you mime and pantomime and you move around and talk about it. Sometimes a guy shows up 10 minutes before a match. I had a match in New Jersey this past April, and on the way, I had to take a cab or an Uber from Philadelphia to New Jersey. Should have been a 45-minute drive. On the way there, a guy was threatening to jump off the overpass, so they had to like stop traffic and divert it or something, and it took me 3 hours in the Uber to get there. So they had to push back my match, and I got there maybe 10 minutes before my match. Didn't even change. I had been doing commentary at a show. This may be the shirt I wore. Now that I look, I may actually be very close to it. But I didn't have time to change. I didn't have time to talk. It was a tag team match. There was 4 people involved. I didn't have time to talk to the other 3 guys, really. We figured out what the ending was going to be, and we went out there and wrestled for, 12 minutes or so. Sometimes you show up and somebody has an entire script written down for you, and you don't want to do any of it. So it's like a Wild West, There's no easy way to answer that question. Sometimes you show up and you don't plan anything out. Sometimes it's like planned too much. Pro wrestling is a weird business in the way that I've been in front of, tens of people and then thousands of people in the same week. And they're all vastly, different environments. It's crazy. It really is. Like no 2 matches are ever the same. No 2 crowds are ever the same. I could wrestle the same guy and do the same exact thing in front of, 2 different crowds, just in 2 different cities. and there'll be completely different reactions to it. So a lot of it is done on the fly, or it should be, you know?
If there's somebody watching this that wants to become a MMA fighter or a pro wrestler, what advice would you give them?
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Anytime somebody asks me, it's the same answer. Don't do it. Don't do it. I love it so much, but that's why I'm saying don't do it, because I became obsessed at too young of an age with pro wrestling. I became too obsessed with MMA. I have a college degree. It's not like I didn't go to school. I had a job, but I wish that I would have stepped back a little bit and had more hobbies, more passions. It's such a tough thing to do. I don't want to. You should probably just cut that whole thing and let me give like an inspirational speech instead and tell everybody to go after their dreams. But it's such a tough business, especially like I couldn't even imagine getting into it now. I was lucky. From my standpoint, I was lucky to get into it when I did, because the level of athletes that are involved in fighting now are just at a much higher caliber than they were when I started. So, my advice would be to get a high paying job somewhere else and then do MMA as a hobby, as your passion.
So it sounds like if you're not 100% committed to doing it, don't even try. Just do it as a hobby. That's what I got from that.
I would say, yeah. I would say if you're not 100%, I don't want to ruin I don't want to dash anyone's hopes and dreams, like I said, but if you're not 100% committed to MMA, I talked earlier and said it's like a very controlled environment when you're fighting. It's not that dangerous, but it's also very dangerous. You know what I mean? In the long run. So, I don't know if it's the toughest sport, but sure, the money, I think it is. If I was a betting man.
Tom Lawlor,
It's toughest sport, MMA.
thanks a lot for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time. It means a lot.